Okay, so we move on to Unit 3, which is going to be a study of the general epistles and the book of Revelation. We'll sort of continue to talk about Paul a little bit when we get to the women in ministry, women in leadership discussion. But we're mostly done with Paul at this point. So here are our key concepts, as always. This is the stuff to pay attention to help you do well on the test. Let's begin by talking about what a general epistle is. We've talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the semester, but let's address it again. An epistle is just a fancy word for letter. We call them general epistles because they have a broad, general, non-specific audience. That's very different than Paul's letters, which are addressed to specific people like Timothy or Titus or Philemon, or to specific churches like the church in Rome, the church in Corinth, the church in Galatia. All right, so the book of James is the first of the general epistles that we're going to look at. And the reason for that is there is some connection to some of the things that Paul says that we'll deal with, and we'll deal with those issues here. But I have on the background here some straw, and the reason for that is Martin Luther, who's the founder of the Protestant Reformation, strongly disliked this particular book. He referred to it as a right strawy epistle. He thought it didn't have the theological weight of something like what Paul's letters did. And while I respect Luther greatly, I think we'll try to see if we can rescue the book of James and see that there's a lot more to it than what Luther seemed to think. So here's our background. We think this book, if this book is written by the person it claims to be written by, then it's written by James, the brother of Jesus. Based on the themes, the issues he's talking about, we tend to think that this book is written between the years 70 and 110 AD. And that creates a problem for us because James probably died in the year 62, maybe the year 69 AD. And so that means that what we're looking at is a possibly pseudonymous work again. Hopefully you have a good understanding of pseudonymity at this point based on the last unit. If you're still a little bit concerned about that and you haven't reached out about it, please do reach out to me about it, and we will continue to delve into that issue. Okay, so on this slide we have a very good example of how James fits our category of general epistle. It is written to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. The technical term for this is Jewish diaspora. In other words, it's written to Jews living outside of the land of Israel. Jews who live in Spain, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Persia, I should say. That's a big, broad, general audience. So that makes it a very non-specific letter. And in fact, a lot of people don't think this was originally a letter. They think that it was a sermon that was then repackaged as a letter, hence the very general audience. And the overall thrust of this sermon or letter is very simple. Belief is good, but now you got to do something with your belief. James is the classic example of putting faith into action. That's what this book is really all about. So he's going to start off by acknowledging that apparently some people in his audience are suffering in some way, and he encourages his audience to consider it pure joy that they are facing trials of any kind. Pro tip from Dr. Wickman. If you are having to comfort somebody who is suffering in some way, shape, or form right now, I would strongly discourage you from using James chapter 1 verse 3 as your go-to verse to read to them. Don't tell them, consider it pure joy that you're sitting in this hospital bed suffering right now. Read that to them after they're recovered and they're reflecting on their time of trial, perhaps. Maybe a nice psalm is where you want to go. James is not trying to be callous here, but what he's getting at here is this idea that suffering is an opportunity for people to grow in their faith. When times are good, we seldom reflect on things as much as when times are bad. That's often the time to improve things and to grow. Just think about perhaps if you've been in a relationship with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or if you're married. Oftentimes relationships grow the most as a result of a healthy fight. That's where we learn more about one another. So suffering is an opportunity to grow, to improve ourselves, according to James. Now, we continue on in James chapter 1, in which he says that the perfect law gives us freedom. Usually we think of laws as things that restrict freedom. A law says that you can only go 65 miles an hour down I-35 if you can go that fast, because we all know there are certain parts of Temple where it slows to a standstill sometimes. But the law says you cannot go faster. You cannot go as fast as you might want to go. Otherwise, there will be penalties for that. What's noteworthy here is that although James and Paul have oftentimes been put into opposition with one another, as we'll see in chapter 2, it's worth noting here that James is saying something very similar to what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 6. So, all right, back to the main point here. What is this idea of how does the law, which seems to restrict our freedom, actually give us freedom? James has a different understanding of freedom than we as Americans typically do. As Americans, I would suggest our basic understanding of freedom is that we have a choice to do whatever we want to do. But from James's point of view, 2,000 years ago, he did not believe that freedom was about a free choice between doing good and doing evil. Instead, he believed that all humans were slaves to their sins. He believed that everybody would ultimately commit sins, and so we were not free. And so the law of Christ gives us freedom because it gives us the ability for the first time ever to choose to be good. So the freedom in a New Testament sense is, looking at that last bullet point, is this idea of freedom from sin, freedom from our slavery to sin. That's a concept I want you to know for the test. It's not about just doing whatever we want to do. It's about our freedom from our slavery to sin. All right, so now that we have been freed from our sins, what are we supposed to do with our lives? And the rest of the first part of chapter 2 talks about economic justice, taking care of the poor, and we can see some strong connections to Old Testament figures here. I've mentioned Amos as an example, but there's a lot of prophets in the Old Testament who talk about this. And so James says, look, it's not appropriate for somebody to say simply, well, I'll pray that your physical needs are met, or just encourage them to have faith and all will be well with them. Instead, he says that, look, anybody who does that kind of thing and simply encourages people to believe, or simply themselves believes, but doesn't do anything about the plight of humanity, about the problems in humanity, about people shivering and going hungry at night, those people They have no faith. Their faith is dead. Now, that's not an overly controversial point for most people, but the beginning part of chapter 2, verse 14 can be troublesome for some people, where he says, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save him? We've had this discussion in class before, and I would love to continue having this discussion, but yeah, that's not going to happen. What James, though, seems to be driving at is this idea that people who believe but do nothing about it, is that a faith that truly brings about salvation? And the plain reading of this text would seem to be no. It's on this slide that we really see the controversy that is created by the book of James, because he really hammers home his point in chapter 2, verse 24, where he says, you see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. This is a very famous verse in the Reformation because it was used against Martin Luther to say that, look, your argument that we are justified by faith and faith alone doesn't hold up to your idea of sola scriptura, your idea of through the Bible alone, because the Bible, quite bluntly, in chapter 2, verse 24 of the book of James, says that you're not justified by faith alone. All right, so how do we deal with this issue then, especially in comparison to the book of Galatians? On this slide, we see that Paul fairly bluntly says that a person is justified by faith, whereas in the book of James, he seems to be saying that we're not justified by faith. How do we reconcile these two issues here? Here's what I would suggest. First, we need to remember what justification is all about. Think back to what I taught you in the book of Galatians video. Justification is not so much how we get saved. It is instead the mark of who is saved. So from James's point of view, the mark of who is saved is not the people who run around saying, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus. You can't trust that those people are saved. The mark of who is saved is the people who are doing what Christ would have us do, which is feed the poor, free the prisoners, take care of the sick, those kinds of things. And so Paul, in the book of Galatians, really never disagrees with that idea, because he does not say the mark of justification is those who run around saying, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus, I believe in Jesus. The mark of justification is no longer these physical symbols, circumcision and who you eat with. It is faith in Jesus. And faith is not just about believing and saying, yes, Jesus is real, Jesus is real, Jesus is real. Instead, faith is a lot more about trusting and being obedient to Jesus, which at that point becomes remarkably similar to what James is saying here. It's possible that James is correcting a misunderstanding of what Paul is going on, of what Paul has said in his letters, but I don't think that James is explicitly disagreeing with Paul. I think he would perhaps be disagreeing with an overreaction to some of Paul's letters. So for test purposes, what I would say is that James and Paul are saying virtually the same thing. Both are saying that belief is necessary. Both are saying that works are the evidence of your belief and thus are faith. And neither one is saying that you can uh, go around proving that you are saved simply by declaring it. Instead, the proof of your salvation has a lot more to do with what you do than what you say. It's the old adage, actions speak louder than words. All right, so that's the hardest, most difficult, most complicated part of the book of James, which means that this is a good opportunity to do a couple of shout outs here. So, Maria the Zealot, hope you're doing pretty well. Gabriel, hope you're doing okay. Adrian, hope you're doing well. Noah, Braden, Sabrina, keep on keeping on, folks. And we'll do more shout outs later on in the semester. For now, let's talk about James chapter 3. A few of you are probably thinking very long and hard about James chapter 3 verse 1, where James says, "Not many of you should presume to be teachers." It's a verse that I take very, very seriously because teachers are going to be judged more harshly. It's a verse that actually makes me really, really nervous. The idea that I dare to stand up in front, or in this case, sit in front of a computer screen and tell people what to believe about the New Testament. That frightens me. That I'm bold enough to be able to do that, and so I genuinely try to teach with a certain sense of humility and acknowledge that sometimes I may be wrong about stuff. It's okay to disagree with me, maybe not on the test, but it's definitely okay to disagree with me because there is stuff that I'm sure that I'm not quite explaining perfectly or I have wrong interpretations about. But to clarify what James seems to mean here, the way he suggests we identify the good teachers, the wise people, are those who are pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. James seems to suggest that if your teacher, be it me, be it your pastor, be it whoever, if your pastor does not exude, or your teacher, I should say, if your teacher does not exude these character traits, that's perhaps a sign they are not filled with God, they are not doing good biblical exegesis. All right, I think that's enough about that. All right, so in James chapter 4, he continues to talk about economic concerns and taking care of the poor, putting faith into action. There's nothing from James chapter 4 that's on the test, and in the spirit of trying to keep things shorter here, I'm just going to move on from James 4 and turn to James chapter 5, where James says, "Do not swear." And he's not talking about four-letter words here. He's talking about making promises. Now, here's something I do want you to understand for the test. Why does James say that we should not swear an oath to someone? And the reason for that has to do with the way you would swear an oath in the ancient world, and we still have shades of this today. Today, sometimes we will use the phrase, "I swear to God," when we mean that I really, really, really promise that I'm going to do something. In the ancient world, people would do the same thing. They would say, "I swear to God," but they would swear to a very specific god. They would say, "I swear to Zeus," "I swear to Jupiter," "I swear to Isis," that I will pay you $20 if you lend it. I will pay you back $20 if you lend it to me today. And when you fail to return that $20, then the oath you have taken in the eyes of Zeus or Jupiter, whoever, it reflects poorly on that god or goddess, just as it reflects poorly on you. Because by invoking the name of a deity, of a god, you are saying, Zeus will enforce this particular agreement or oath that I am making to you. And when Zeus doesn't strike you dead with lightning for failing to keep your promise, then Zeus looks bad. So a Christian should not say, I swear to God or I swear to Jesus that I will do something, because if you don't do it and Jesus doesn't strike you dead with lightning, which he probably won't do, then you make Jesus look bad. So you should not swear an oath because it will make Jesus or the Christian God look bad. All right, that wraps up the book of James, together with the lecture on Hebrews. That brings us to the close of lectures for a little while. We will move into a discussion. We will move into our women in ministry discussion, and I promise details on that will be forthcoming soon if I haven't already posted them by the time that you are listening to that. All right, talk at you again soon.